If you are serious about sound quality, you will already know that the amplifier in your HiFi system matters. And I think they are worth spending money on because when you have a very good amplifier in your system, you know all about it. And it's likely one you'll want to keep for a very long time. And the amplifier I'm going to be speaking to you about in this video, it is one of those. It is one of the very good ones. The Virtus A3 is what Canor Audio are calling an all-in-one hybrid integrated amplifier. And those two definitions, hybrid and all-in-one, I think will mean different things to different people. The A3 is an integrated amplifier that has a phono stage, a DAC and a headphone section built into it. It doesn't have any digital music streaming, so you will need a music source, a digital one, an analog one, or why not both. And Canor's meaning of hybrid is likely different to what you're thinking because contrary to what's been said elsewhere, this is not a tube integrated amplifier, it's a solid state one that uses a tube as part of a very clever, unique circuit design that I'll do my best to try and explain and show you shortly. But anybody who's been a fan of Quad's current dumping amplifiers will likely really appreciate the Virtus A3. Whereas others might love that Canor are saying the A3 pretty much gives you a Class A sound character without the Class A headaches. And that sounds fantastic, but how many times have we heard something like that before? Excuse the puns. But let's start from the beginning. Canor Audio are from Slovakia, and they are celebrating 30 years of business, and that is no small feat in itself. And if you are familiar with other Canor products, you will see the familiarity here with the quite understated but very well made casework. And I think the A3 reminds me of the famous saying, are you a shower or are you a grower? Because when you power her on, she or he maybe definitely is a grower because the expected orange color matrix type display really pops. But what you don't expect is a high resolution volume wheel touchscreen surrounded by the really nice orange halo glow that I think is lovely. But it does make the volume wheel really stand out like it's very excited to see you. And the A3 does have a pretty average sized height to its casework. Maybe it's a touch bigger than average, but it's definitely deeper than average for an integrated amplifier. And I assume Canor had to do that to fit everything in. So I would say, what's the famous saying? Measure twice and cut once. If you're considering putting this into some type of TV furniture, just make sure you measure first. And also think about ventilation because it does get warm. Round the back, you start to see what I think is great about this amplifier. I love how far apart the speaker cable terminals are because it makes wiring up easier and neater. I also really like how there is an even balance of analog connections in and out. Having dual balanced XLR inputs I think is great, as most integrateds in this price category only have one. Where I am more confused is with the digital inputs for using the built-in DAC. There is no HDMI EARC here, and that could be a deal breaker for some, but others won't care, as a recent poll I did concluded. I am more disappointed that both coaxial inputs are RCA and one is not BNC, because having one of each I think would make more sense. Also, having a USB-C input will be great for many as it's the modern choice, but I would have liked to have also had a USB Type-B input as that is more of the legacy HiFi connection. But we really need to have the lid off to take a look inside because I have not seen an amplifier like this before. No one will. It has a unique design that is based on Quad's current dumping amplifier designs by the legendary Peter Walker. And Canor say they have great admiration for the work Peter did, but have managed to engineer out the weaknesses of those designs to reduce the amplifier's distortion, such as engineering their own unique flat coil output stage inductor. The A3 is a fully differential amplifier for all its analog inputs. It uses a very linear tube input stage, driving a bipolar MOSFET Class A power stage. The Class A stage load is benign, so always very linear, and it's responsible for the sound quality of the amp as it controls the speaker load. But the current dumping design means a Class AB output stage is also used for the amplifier's muscle for delivering heavier speaker loads. But there is no transition between the two, so the amplifier always has a Class A sound, and I'm best I can relaying the information from a white paper Canor sent to me. The tube is there as a very linear device and to add some tube character to the music, and I think that is important here. And they are using JJE88cc tubes that have been tested and specifically chosen by Canor, so it's not one intended to be rolled, and it's expected to last 4,000 hours because of how the amplifier handles it. The tube is also a fully differential part of the amplifier's feedback circuits, with each channel's capacitor bank being very close to the output stage for a fast reserve, again for demanding speaker loads. However, the amplifier has direct DC coupling, so there are no capacitors in the signal chain. And what even a non-engineer eye like mine can see is like the dual mono, the obvious like dual mono construction of the design. But what I found difficult to see and even more difficult to get on camera is the lower layers of the amplifier, because down there is a sizable toroidal transformer and very sizable, I assume, power supply, capacitors and more. And that is not helped by what dominates the eye. The two custom-made what look like computer CPU heatsink coolers, and there are fans underneath them that I assume keep air flowing through the coolers the same as in a computer. And if you have your ear an inch from the amplifier casework in the silent room, you can hear the fans. But other than that, I didn't hear them once, even after several days of continuous use. The preamplifier in the A3 is solid state based with a stepped attenuator for controlling the volume, with the control knob using a CCD based sensor, so it doesn't have a typical stiff resistance, and that is a little off-putting at first. But when you stop and think about your hand movement, the volume changes are very sensitive to even very small adjustments, but they also keep up when you make very large adjustments too. So that is very cool, although I'm sure some of you would still prefer a stiff knob. We have to speak about the touchscreen, which is a little unusual, although it is a design nice touch. You can swipe left or right to select between the different inputs, and it's very responsive. Then you swipe up, then swipe left or right again to select between the amplifier's different options. And these are only basic setup options, so this is not something you need to access a lot. I didn't really love this aspect to the design. It felt a little bit fiddly with my fat fingers, although it is nice to look at. But I'm not a massive fan of the VU meter option. But look, this is such a small part of this overall amplifier, it's not really going to have much effect on you day to day. And the animation of the tube when you turn the amp on and off, that's very nice. So I think there are more pros than cons with the screen. But one thing that will affect you day to day is the remote control, which is a custom made plastic one. And I probably should mention the power of the A3. Canor say it can deliver 100 watts IHF dynamic, which I think is the same as peak, into 8 ohms. So it's 100 watts into 8 ohms and 150 watts IHF dynamic again into 4 ohms. So it's not going to be the most powerful amplifier on paper that you can buy at its retail price of £5,995 in the UK, or just under $6,500 for you guys in the US. So again, it's not going to be the most powerful on paper amplifier for the money, and it is quite a lot of money as well. However, now you've seen the internals and how many components are in there and how clever the design is, I think it's understandable why it's going to cost more. But who is the Canor Virtus A3 for? And I actually think it's probably geared towards two key categories of people. Firstly, it might be someone who's looking to level up their amplifier game. Maybe they have an amplifier in the maybe £2,000 to £3,000 price range, and they're looking for a big upgrade in amplifier sound quality and performance, and maybe features. And I tested this as part of the review. But I also think the A3 is capable and more than good enough to be someone's downsizing system. If somebody's downsizing from, a bigger separate system and they want a system or an amplifier with more convenience but without losing too much performance in the process, I think the A3 fits that category as well. I can summarize the sound of the A3 really very easily because it delivers pretty much everything we would want from a modern integrated amplifier. It sounds clean, it sounds lively, it sounds fast, it sounds very dynamic, it sounds like it's always in control of the speakers, so we get a very organized and precise soundstage in a very good all-rounder type of fashion, and that would probably be enough for most people. But it also sounds really quite sweet, and it has a noticeably richer tonal palette, like timbres come through richer and nicer and more pleasing, or maybe more authentic, but I'm always looking for pleasing, and that definitely stands out to me. And it has a little bit of charm about how it sounds as well. When you add all of that combination together, I think it makes the A3 stand out as a modern integrated amplifier. And for me, it stood out most notably in the treble region. Like the treble quality and clarity and sweetness was just stand out good, really very good from this amplifier. And I think probably more importantly, this is a great combination that will work with a lot of modern designed hi-fi speakers that would benefit from a bit more richness and tonality to their sound. And that stands out here because you get it without other compromises. During my initial listening, testing and just getting to know the A3, I was listening to both digital and vinyl. And that led me to do something I wouldn't normally do, and that was some comparison listening to the same music on digital and vinyl. And the reason I did this was because I was questioning what I was hearing. I was very surprised at the quality of the sound from the A3's digital section or its DAC. And that is again because of that richer tonality. I was getting a tonality and richness and authentic timbre to vocals and instruments that I just really wasn't expecting from, a DAC built into an integrated amplifier. And that is why I wanted to see how it compared to a very nice Origin Live turntable setup with a high quality Sumiko styling moving core cartridge. And the big one for tonality here is my valve-based W.I.T.F PH9XT phono stage. Listening to the same music on both analog and digital, I used the album's Lady Blackbird Black Acid Soul, which is a big female vocalist and just a nice but big scale production. I used an audiophile album called Fascination with Sound because it's got a real mixture of really nicely recorded instruments and bits on it, but I also threw into Metallica because why not? And what I noticed was that they didn't sound the same, the digital and the vinyl, but the quality of sound was really quite similar between the two. The vinyl definitely had the nicer and smoother flow about it, but the digital had the cleaner, more precise delivery. But I was listening for the tonality, and it was pretty close. The vinyl still had the edge, I think, but I was expecting to hear a bigger difference. I think it showed that the A3 has some obvious charm, regardless of the input. And it's a charm that I just like. It's like a nicety to the music. And the fact that the DAC section was more than holding its own and better in some ways, compared to like a very expensive, nice, set up by an idiot, but nice vinyl turntable setup, that was just high praise. I just took a lot from that. The DAC in the A3 is using dual ESS Sabre 9038 chips. So we have the usual ESS DAC filter modes, and most of them make only a subtle difference. However, one of the filter modes was new to me, and it's called Optimum Transients. And this mode is fantastic for a more 3D or expanded sense of soundstage. And it's a real digital cracker of a filter mode because it just gives you a little bit more sense of space, like separation between instruments or like within the musical soundstage. And that can be very nice. And I think some audiophiles will love this mode. And I later found out that this is a Canor specific mode and it disables a lot of what ESS have done with the DACs. I also did a lot of different volume testing to see what the A3's maximum might be before it started to harden up or compress, or just lose some composure. And to my amazement, I was giving up before the A3 wanted to, because the A3 sounds very clean, very composed, regardless of how much you push the volume. In saying that, I did think that maybe I wasn't getting quite the same like big muscular type of sound from the A3 that you can get or I have had in the past from bigger amplifiers that generally cost a lot more money. Like there's like a muscular nature to some amplifiers. I wasn't really getting that from the A3, and I think you noticed that a bit in the bass when you turn the volume up a lot. Some big powerful amplifiers sometimes seem to have like a more of a muscular presentation. The A3 is not really like that. It's more about getting hold of the speakers and staying very controlled and very tight and very articulate with the bass, rather than sounding like kind of like big and muscular with it. So there is a difference in that, and that is me judging from memory. So look, take that with a pinch of salt, but that was my initial takeaway. But I'm also being really fussy there because the bass quality was excellent for an integrated amplifier at this price. It was excellent. And at medium volume levels, the A3 is a real charmer. Because it has that more full-bodied, richer tonality, I didn't feel the need to push the volume to try and fill out the sound like I do with some other amplifiers. And that will be a big deal to a lot of people. The A3 features both a moving magnet and moving coil phono stage that you set up either using the remote control or the touchscreen. And how much better is this compared to dip switches? I really hate dip switches. This is much better. There is likely enough setup options for most cartridges. However, there is not as many as you would see on a dedicated high-end external phono stage. So check compatibility before you spend any money. I was very pleasantly surprised to see 66 dB of gain for the moving coil input, because that matches my external W.I.T.F phono stage, and I like a higher amount of gain with the Sumiko styling cartridge, as I think it sounds more solid overall. Where the phono stage I think sounds really good is again like that richer tonality, richer than you expect, a really nice, it's just a nice tonality to vocals and instruments. And it's also quite a lively sounding phono stage, quite upbeat and energetic, and that surprised me actually. And it has a crisper, a more noticeably crisp treble, it did compared to the W.I.T.F. And that does kind of keep music sounding a bit more lively and a bit more upbeat, but it's still sweet sounding. So you get, again, just a nice balance of the two. And you also get an excellent sense of soundstage space with nice depth and layering to the music, coming from behind the speakers or maybe out into the room to some degree. And I would classify the phono stage as having quite a typical British hi-fi sound. And to me, that means the bass is just a touch leaner to allow for more space in the middle of the soundstage. So it always feels open. You know, it's an open soundstage, what audiophiles call an airy soundstage. So quite like a little bass leaner, but like it gives the soundstage more space, kind of space to breathe is how people describe it. And that is great. And I know some people love this type of presentation, and I appreciate it, but it's not quite my preference. I like a more full-bodied, stronger, more full-bodied sound. But interestingly, listening to some Daft Punk cranked up really loud, I had nothing to complain about. Yes, this is a really good pressing, but the music sounded easily bassful enough even for me, and the crazy intense ending to Giorgio Moroder was dynamic and really fast and upbeat and lively, but with no hardness or harshness at all, and that was impressive. So at this point, I was feeling like the A3 is a real cracker of an integrated amplifier and what I sometimes call a gem, an absolute gem hi-fi product. And that is because it was hitting very closely to my own personal preference, and it was just working fantastically well with the speakers, the Audio Solutions Figaro M2. But I also know, listening in isolation can fool you, and you need to do side-by-side, as Darko calls them, comparisons. So I always plan to do that anyway, and these are proper comparisons with all the products here at the same time, and that's very different to comparing products from memory. So the first set of comparisons I wanted to do would be an upgrade path for somebody. Could or would the Virtus A3 offer somebody a significant amplifier improvement or upgrade if they currently have, or if they was coming from and integrated in maybe the £2,000 to £3,000 price range, factoring in like the rule of doubles? And for me, that meant comparing it to two integrateds, the Cambridge Audio EXA 100 and the Audiolab 9000A, because they are my reference integrated amplifiers around this price. And I know these integrated so well by now, and I thought the A3 would probably give me the best of both. And listening to the Cambridge, it is a real cracker of an amp for the money, because it sounds very front foot lively and dynamic, maybe even more so than the A3 when you initially listen to it. It sounds like it's got a lot of power and control over the speakers and makes them sound very big. Again, impressive for the money. However, going back to the Canor, straight away there was just more richness and fullness to all music. And once it's warmed up, it was easily matching the Cambridge's dynamic sound. And going back to the Cambridge after, that richness, that fullness, that nicer timbre and tonality did feel missing. So you do get a lot more from the A3, which is justified given the massive price difference. Now the Audio Lab has a sweeter sound compared to the Cambridge and tonally was a little closer to the A3. However, it still came up really quite short compared to the A3's richer, bolder, more sweet tonality. Plus it didn't have the dynamics to match up to it either. So my thoughts have not changed here. The 9000A and EXA100 are both excellent integrateds at their price, and I can confirm that the A3 would offer you a significant upgrade over those two in pretty much every way. You get the best of both and more, and a better DAC section and a better quality phono stage. So it's a lot more money, but the price I think is justified. The testing proved that to me. But of course I also wanted to compare it and test it against some similar priced alternatives, and £6,000 goes a long way in 2025. You can buy very good quality pre-power separate systems for that money, and I have two here, the A75 and P75 from Galleon Audio and the Eversolo A10F10. So I wanted to test, can an integrated amplifier hold its own? Can it better? Can it live with good quality pre-powers at that same kind of price level? And this testing was a little trickier to keep fair. So in my best attempt, I used the Eversolo A10 always for the music source. And I used it for a DAC and a preamp as well where necessary. And I started by listening to the Eversolo pairing, as I know it has a warmer, more full sonic delivery. But my guesstimation was that it would be a different type of warmer sound. Listening to this setup, it was straight away much closer to the A3 in terms of not only the overall sound quality, but the fullness of the sound. In fact, the A10F10 sounds very big and punchy and full in the bass, and I like that a lot for modern electronic music and reggae, but it was also great for a bit of 80s music like the classic Blue Monday by New Order, where the opening bass was really kicking me with the volume up bonkers high. And I was actually wondering whether this was straight away where I would start to hear some difference between what an integrated amplifier can do, even a good one, compared to like a separate, dedicated, powerful, standalone power amplifier. And it was interesting because when I used the same test tracks, the Lady Blackbird, the Metallica, and also the Fascination with Sound, like the really nice tonality of instruments, the A10F10 sounded warm, but it's like a different kind of warm. It's like a thicker type of warm, slightly darker in the treble and thicker type of warm, and it's very pleasing. And it was kind of close to the A3, but listening to, again, it was the instruments, the way they was coming through, it sounded like some of the smaller details were maybe being just a little smothered in favour of that warmer, bolder sound. And what stood out about the A3 was that you got a nice rich tonality, but with the clarity, with the speed, with the control. There was no trade-off for that richer tone. There was a but though, back to what I said before earlier about the A3 not having like that kind of muscular kind of sound. The A10F10, it's not the most fast, it's not the most articulate sounding kind of amplifier pre-power setup, but it does have that kind of weighty, that ballsy, that big amplifier sound. Like it just gives music a bit more scale and grandiose sense in the room, and that was happening better than what I was getting from the A3. So that was another interesting difference. But how much of this was its DAC, or how much of it was just the amplifier? I needed to know. So this was an easy time to test that, because I could also use the DAC in the Eversolo and just use the A3 as an integrated amplifier to see how the DACs between them compare. And I literally listened to one song to hear how the overall scale and fullness I had been appreciating about the A10F10, I was now getting from the A3 too. And the system sounded meatier and weightier and more full in the room. But there was some trade-off to the speed and articulation of the music, just a smidgen. But I preferred the more full, weighty sound, but I know others would prefer the speedier, more articulated presentation of the A3's DAC. The important takeaway from this is that even though both are using ESS Sabre DACs, they don't sound the same. But really it was that the A3's amplifier could go toe-to-toe with the power amplifier of the F10, the A10F10. Like for scale, for bass, for like grandiose of sound, the amplifier could go toe-to-toe. But it was the DAC sections that were different, like the The Ever Solo DAC section it's a little heavy sounding, but it's more big, more full, more weighty sounding. The DAC in the A3 is more about speed and crisp and articulation, a little bit more about soundstage openness and space. So we have a difference there. I prefer the more weighty sound. Again, some might prefer the more speed and articulation, the slightly more spacious. But there was a difference, right? This is a difference that you need to think about and know about. My last comparison felt very rudimentary, as I knew everything I needed to know by now about the A3 for all its best points and maybe its less good points. But I also thought it could be interesting to test how the Gallium AMP75, a preamp power setup that is more of a normal hybrid setup with a valve preamplifier and solid state power amplifier compared. And I do like the Galliums a lot, but this was my least favourite amplifier setup of the three, and really that didn't surprise me, as this wouldn't be the one I would recommend with the Figaro speakers, because their voicings, I think, are a bit too samey if such a thing exists. However, it was still a good comparison to do, because it made the conclusion to all of this really very easy. The A3 more than held its own with these two very highly regarded pre and power amplifier setups, like dedicated preamplifier and dedicated power amplifiers. As an integrated amplifier, it more than held its own, and it was actually my favorite of the three because it balanced the tonality with the clarity and the speed and the liveliness without there being any penalty to anything else, with the exception of maybe that heavyweight bass that I would use a different DAC and still get that. So what more can you say? What more is there to say? It's very, very high praise. And yes, the A3 is slightly more expensive, but you do have the convenience of the one box solution, so you would save money on cables, and it has a good quality, a better quality, or has a phono stage that the other two do not. So factoring all that in, on the whole of this listening and comparison, extensive comparison, that's why the A3 has made, a really big mark on me. It's really impressed me. And the bit that people might have an issue with it is that it doesn't have a digital streaming system built in, but that's the part of the industry that's moving the fastest. So actually having a separate digital source might make more sense. And if you bought a good one with a really good DAC in it, you could probably combine and get a really hell of a lot from the A3 integrated. The amplifier section in it is excellent. The phono stage is excellent. The DAC is very good. It just falls a bit short of maybe the very best. But look, it's an integrated. There's always going to be some compromise, but there isn't as much compromise as maybe I was expecting here. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope you found it useful and helpful. If you have enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to see more.